A lot of people ask about the Watson's pulse analysis on the right-hand side. I want to spend a little bit of time explaining how we think about this. First of all, the way that we get this analysis is the words that were offered in the answers are sent to IBM Watson, and they're scored and then averaged and provided in these charts. The first thing that's important to think about is that Watson does not know you personally and doesn't know your team personally and doesn't know your industry. It's thinking and listening at about an 8th grade or a 9th grade level. And all it has to go off of are the words that you're providing. So just like a complete outsider, a complete stranger that you meet on the street, all it hears is the words that you're using and tries to make insights out of those words. If you notice sometimes that the positivity doesn't sound exactly right to you, that's probably because the language that you've developed in your team is a little bit different than the average language on the street or the average language of an 8th or 9th grade communicator. So ideas that you might think of as really positive, Watson might not pick up on those things. The same thing for words that might be really negative to you, Watson might have a different opinion. That's why we think this is useful. It's providing an outsider's perspective of what's happening in this conversation, and that complements the conversation that you can read here from your colleagues. The sentiment analysis is the more complex part of this tool. And in order to understand this, there are a few frameworks that we need to think about. First, it's helpful to understand that Watson has been scoring the conversation using a framework called the Ocean Personality Framework. If you Google the Ocean Personality, you will learn a lot about this framework. It's a very common framework used by the psychological community to understand personalities. It studies openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. You might notice that the language we're using here is slightly different, and that's just because we've simplified it for a broader audience. The important thing to know here is that this is based on a consistent framework that's being applied every time to the answers that are being received. Now, to get more information and more insight out of this, it's helpful to introduce a framework called left brain versus right brain, or left hemisphere versus right hemisphere. Now, this is a very common framework, again, in psychology, having to do with the side of the brain that individuals think with more dominantly. It's commonly believed that more analytical and methodical thinking is more left brain thinking, whereas creative and artistic thinking is more right brain thinking. These traits have been organized according to this framework. So the more focused and balanced traits are the left brain dominant traits. The friendly and creative traits are the right brain dominant traits. When I look at this, I will do a quick analysis to compare the left brain. I'll look to see where the average is. If it's above 50% between these two, I would say this is a left brain dominated conversation, as opposed to the friendly and creative, which you can see are below 50%. So that would confirm to me that this is a left brain dominated. If you see that they are both above 50%, then that would mean that it's a very engaged conversation. That would mean that both hemispheres are working cooperatively together to communicate the ideas that are necessary in order to answer the question. So this is important, left brain versus right brain. The last framework that's helpful to think about with regard to this chart is something called the social versus personal identity. And this has to do with, again, a psychological idea of how people identify themselves as individuals versus parts of a group. We have organized the traits here as well to help us understand this idea better, with the more individual traits on the outside and the more group traits in the middle. People are more focused and more creative. We tend to be more so on our own, whereas balance, alignment, and friendliness are more of a collective, more of a group trait. So when I look at this, if I look at the average of these three traits, or I look at the average of these outer traits, it's pretty clear to me that this is bringing up more of a group tone, more group-focused thinking, and less individualistic thinking. And it's interesting, if you read the question, what must be in place for casual interactions to be worthwhile? This is obviously talking about interacting with other people, and that also kind of resonates with what we're seeing here. So with these three frameworks, the Ocean Personality, left brain versus right brain, and social versus personal identity, you start to get a picture of what Watson is hearing in this conversation. And then hopefully as you go through and read the rest of the answers, you'll get more insight and you'll be able to see a little bit of the contrast between the way a complete outsider hears this conversation and the way that you maybe interpret this conversation. I encourage you to Google these frameworks if you'd like to learn more about them, or reach out to us if you have more questions about this, and we'd be happy to help.